Tina Stome, and I work on urban issues and local governance with the systems transformation lens here at UNDP. The Urban Talk series is showcasing how cities are demonstrating resilience, reinventing their economies, transitioning to inclusive and smart cities, and building new partnerships. And the series is a space for us to exchange insights and learning and bring together a growing community of cities, practitioners, and thinkers that are approaching urban challenges in a systemic way. And today we're very excited to have Jayne Engle with us. Jayne has a rich and varied professional experience of more than 25 years. She's an urbanist, a strategist, experimentalist, and curator of ecosystems and change processes. Jayne is currently co-director of Participatory Canada, part of the Participatory City Global Ecosystem, and a collaborator with the Aguirre Lejantacaria Center, and also working with UNDP on social listening, learning, and co-creation processes in Eastern European cities. And released this year is her new book, which is called Sacred Civics, Building 7th-Generation Cities. Jayne has a PhD in urban planning, policy and design, and an MBA in real estate development and urban land studies. Jayne is a city planner and builder, and here I'm going to quote your recent book, Jayne. She is committed to urban system transformations for the long term that are radically inclusive, decolonizing, and ennobling. Welcome, Jayne. Good to have you with us.
Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here.
Excellent. And our talk today then is on 7th-generation cities, crafting value narratives for recovery. And just a bit on our run of show, we will first do a presentation by Jayne around unpacking 7th-generation cities. Then we would like to hear your reflections from you as the audience. So we will run a Mentimeter, and my colleague Darini will lead us through that. And then, of course, we'll open it up for questions and reflections together with Jayne. And as always, please mute your microphones and feel free to post any questions, thoughts, reflections in the chat as we go along. So with that, we're very excited, Jayne. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Really great to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, perhaps, wherever people are. And a special thanks to you, Tina, Darini, Leila, and the UNDP team for this invitation, and to people in this room. I'm really looking forward to our discussion afterwards. So I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Does that look good? You can see my full screen? Okay, awesome.
Good.
All right. So first thing I want to do is acknowledge place. So I'm calling in from a city on an island, which is also known as Montreal, but originally it was known as Tiohtià:ke by Indigenous Mohawk peoples. And they are the peoples who stewarded the lands and the waters here around the island for thousands of years before European colonial settlers arrived and called the place Montreal. And I say that because for those who may not be aware, a very important part of where I'm coming from is that in Canada, starting about 15 years ago, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that involved a deep listening process from survivors of a horrific so-called residential school, in an institutional system that aimed literally to eradicate Indigenous cultures. And it's been a transformational journey in many ways, including for me personally. And it's also a reminder that societies can change. Now, is it enough? No, not nearly, but it's a start. And it's a great source of commitment for the work I do and inform the lens and biases that I bring to this talk. And also it informs my commitments that Tina mentioned in the beginning, and is part of the motivation for working on this book. And so part of that starting point is that in many ways, our current systems, our economies, we are colonizing the future. And it's a trend that can be changed if we're wise enough, we have collective will, a sense of stewardship, and capability for coordinated organizing and action to do so. So I want to also acknowledge the co-editors and contributors to the book, which informs a good part of this talk. So the 25 of us come from different backgrounds, traditions, geographies. We share a commitment to different ways of thinking and building cities for the long term. And I am conscious of my own positionality. I'm a descendant of settlers from Europe to this continent. And I also want to name that issues of identity are so important and that they can also be fraught. But I want to recognize that every human being is also multitudes, and often all of us have multi-layered identities. Many of those aren't visible on a two-dimensional screen. These identities are conflicting, they're paradoxical, and they're also continually changing. So I think that's very important to recognize, and that's part of the sacred in each of us. So what I'm going to say in the next 30 minutes, it's very much informed by the book. It's also based on my experience that Tina described in city planning, city innovations, urban development in various parts of the world, places of extreme change, including working in Haiti after the earthquake. And also, I was very fortunate to work in Central and Eastern Europe in the post-Soviet era in the early and mid-1990s. So one of the questions that is central in this work, and a starting point for the talk, is this: how can we build the physical, digital, social, institutional infrastructures needed so that children in 7 generations will thrive in just, radically inclusive, caring, and regenerative cities? And in a context of building planetary solidarity. I'll come more to that later on. So why 7 generations? So 7 generations, it's an indigenous teaching with a number of variants, but it commits people in any planning or key decision-making process to consider at least 7 generations into the past and 7 generations into the future. And rather than it being thought of as a precise number of years, you can think of it as a metaphor for committing to intergenerational justice and long-term futures. So it's really about looking centuries into the future, not only decades or years or even quarters, as we so often do. So the broader backdrop for the talk is that we live in historically novel times, as any of you will know who are paying attention to what's happening. This is sometimes called the polycrisis, the combination of polarization and social unrest, war, of course, in the region where many of you are based, and in many parts of the world, actually, energy crisis, climate disasters, inequalities growing, pandemic, housing and cost of living, and so on. We're in an era of existential risks, and it's so important to be honest about that and to actually respond with our scale of ambition to the extent and the depth of the crises that we are in. So the change is now exponential, and it's with respect to challenges which are deeply interconnected. What we're seeing now is that the future becomes the present more rapidly. This talk that I'm giving today, I wouldn't have given the same talk a couple of months ago, right? Things are changing. It means that by the time a problem is manifest, it can be too late to address it successfully. So we really have to get out in front, building our institutions, rebuilding our institutions differently so that we can usher in a different kind of future for all of us. I'll reference in a couple of places this latest UNDP report. I'm not completely through it yet. It's new, it's excellent. And just one part of it talks about some of the kinds of institutional infrastructure we need for this era that we're moving into. Okay, so the arc of the talk is threefold, and this is also really the thesis of the book. That's that cities matter. We live in an era which can also be called, it's usually called the Anthropocene. Even within that, some call it the Urbanocene. Jeffrey West, in his book Scale, coined this term a few years ago. We also recognize holism. That means that everything is connected. We need to think in systems and act in terms of systems, and even more deeply into the notions of sacred spirituality and what we value. And then third is cities are critical agents of change for rising above the current trajectories and helping to build vastly different futures. So we'll come to transcending. So what can we do? What can we do about this? How are cities well placed to provide responses that address the crises that we're in? So first, urbanocene. Cities are the largest human construct, right? And they're immense, they're complex systems of systems, they change on a daily basis, they're shaped by multiple entanglements, often competing interests. There are something like, depending on how you measure, there's something like 10,000 cities in the world. More than 500 of those have over 1 million people, nearly 100 have over 5 million people. So they're economic powerhouses, sites of extraordinary innovation and beauty, and also obscene and rising inequality. So a very interesting thing about cities relative to nation states and organizations is that they tend to persist much longer term. There's something that's irresistible and magnetic about cities. So there have been all kinds of attempts in the past to keep people out of cities. And even when people know that their outcomes might be worse and are likely to be worse if they move to cities, they still do it. People can't resist being together. They go for all sorts of reasons. But it's important to note that cities are also ground zero for the poly crisis. And of course, with rising climate migration, that will be increasingly the case. So also in the report, also in the report from UNDP, urbanization, highlighted here in red, is a major societal driver of a number of climate hazards. How we build our cities matters deeply for the future of the planet. Okay, so second point, holism. Everything is interconnected. So Sacred Civics is intended as a galvanizing invitation, a cultivation of capability to transcend the persistent cultural narrative that we have of separation and its continual reproduction in the space and imaginaries of cities. So separation is a myth. Siloing will not work. It's useful to separate things in order to study them, in order to analyze them, but there is a tremendous loss by not seeing the whole, not seeing fully, not recognizing interdependencies. So many of us in this room know that, we see that, and at the same time, we're very often organized for change in silos. And addressing things in silos, we can see really just doesn't work. A great example is seeing climate as something that is fixable with technologies, also called climate isolationism, which is really absurd. I've heard city leaders say, all we need to do to fix climate is to switch to electric vehicles, retrofit all our buildings, and we're done. The thing is, even if that were possible, and it's not, by the way, it's nowhere nearly enough. So we have to see differently. Another challenge, deep and growing challenge that separation is linked to is the notion of polarization. So as we all know, our information ecologies, our systems for listening to each other, for dialogue, for trust building, are not working. So we argue in the book that to think in terms of the sacred can be unifying. So that's recognizing inherent dignity, worth of each person, recognizing also that we fully rely on nature for life. Nature is not separate from cities. Cities, all of us in cities rely on natural law to exist. So cultural narratives can play a super strong role in addressing polarization and the myth of separation. So Sacred Civics is about giving reverence, valuing deeply relationships, relationality. And that means between people, with life, with the earth, through time, and giving space and expression for that in cities. So it recognizes the spiritual dimension of people. Yes, we are bodies, we are minds, we are intellectual, we have emotions, and we also have spirit. There is a mystical, deeper part of each of us that, that is about our dignity as human beings. Recognizing that and bringing that into how we build, how we live, how we govern ourselves, how we, very importantly, determine and distribute wealth is absolutely essential. Those cannot be simply technocratic endeavors. So this also recognizes that cities have a soul. So the soul of the city is our people and the life she sustains, past, present, and future, the spirit of the place herself, and the possibility that that represents. And that is not currently manifest in the dominant economic logics of our cities. And this ties as well with the recognition that Indigenous and other forms of knowledges and worldviews have a great deal to teach us about city building. So wherever you are, there may be either Indigenous or other worldviews, cultural systems where governance and legal systems are very different than what has come to dominate the dominant paradigm of Western worldviews, in which rights of nature are part of governance, are part of legal systems, where law is a verb, where we all have a responsibility to law together. And that means continually updating our legal systems rather than considering them as fixed and impossible to change, as we do for the most part. And I want to mention as well that the idea of the sacred is not about religion per se. It's about a sense of shared purpose and meaning, a sense of connection between people and with nature, whatever religion people have or not. And it's about really a collective raising of human consciousness and connection with all life and with the planet. And so it's really an invitation to urban imaginaries that bring into being such notions of deeper, higher quality relationality, for example, that recognizes, that uses really a different set of lenses for infrastructure and investment decisions, because these ought to consider higher order responsibilities, which I'll come to in a bit, longer term thinking with different economic purposes. And just imagine what it opens up to think of cities in terms of that kind of reciprocity with nature, for example. And this is so important because the extent of our collective trauma and collective healing that's needed in connection with forms of oppression, genocide, colonialism, and enslavement of peoples and of lands, it's immense. It's also ongoing, and it has to be tended to foundationally for us to create planetary solidarity that's actually necessary for improving the trajectory that we have as a species. So that's a lot, and it's heavy, but from my point of view, it's really important to continually see and acknowledge realities as they're evolving, and to name them. These are my perspectives right now. These are not full truths, but I wanted to share that because I think it's so important, because it also helps to raise the kind of the level of ambition that we need to set for ourselves. So that level of ambition is about transcending so much of what exists. It means, well, one set of responses is 7th generation cities. Of course, it's not the only set, but this is one set. And it invites valuing differently. It invites breaking assumptions that we carry, which are really social constructs, and about making bold moves. And I'll look forward to coming to hopeful examples at the end. So value. What do we sacralize in cities? So when I say sacralize, I mean, what do we deem collectively has a higher good? So very often, without stating it this way, one of the dominant cultural narratives is techno-capital or techno-solutionism. property ownership is quasi-sacralized. And we don't often say that, but that is actually how we value in terms of the financialization of housing, in terms of how most of our economic logics work. So it's important that we name that because we have a choice to value differently. So it invites asking, what's the economy for? Should its purpose be, as it currently is, to extract value from nature and people as quickly as possible, or should it be to support flourishing of life? So a well-being economy is about getting towards this. What would that look like at the city level? It invites thinking differently about value creation, and it means adding a notion of sacred values to the equation. As one of my heroes here, Jacinda Ardern, has said, economic growth accompanied by worsening social outcomes is not success, it is failure. Social outcomes, health, nature, equality, trust, participation, honor, justice, these are sacred values that need to be valued differently in our economic systems. So it's much easier to say than to do. But it requires thinking differently about accountabilities. And in accountabilities also is the notion of accounting. So it actually will mean changing accounting systems in many cases to value assets differently. So things now like urban forests, which are often liabilities on the balance sheets of cities, need to become assets. So there are so many implications for this. I'm not going to go into these in depth, but just to name the 4 accountabilities that we need to build into systems in order to be built for the future. So accountabilities to future generations and developing proxies for that, to the health of the planet. We cannot live without healthy nature. Designed world, so reimagining our relationships with what we make, building circular economies, and with all people. So that means recognizing the ecological debt of countries, which is one part of this. Ecological debt of high consumption countries to low consumption countries is articulated very well, not exactly like that, but it's articulated very well actually in the last UNDP report that came out in 2020. By the way, those UNDP reports are just getting better and better. I think it's a huge kudos to UNDP for those. So how do you translate these accountabilities to the city level? Well, it means redefining infrastructure, social, ecological, digital, institutional, that we need for this age. And it means intensive investment in nature-inspired infrastructure. If your city is building infrastructure that is not nature-inspired, that lens needs to be on everything. So urban forests, rewilding where we can, technologies for more permeable landscapes, even permeable streets, daylighting rivers. An example is in Seoul, Korea. This used to be a highway. The river was underneath the highway. The highway was torn down, and now a river runs straight through the middle of Seoul, Korea. So assumptions to bust. Now, almost everything we do is socially constructed, and it's so important to recognize that, because the only thing that we cannot change is sacred natural law. We all need air to breathe. We all need water to drink. Almost everything else is socially constructed. So the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something we make and could just as easily make differently. It's not easy to do it, but we must challenge all of our assumptions. And I want to raise just 3 in particular. So one is ownership. In so many cultures, the right to private land ownership is sacrosanct. In the world we need to create, should that be the case, or can we think about land ownership very differently? Actually, in many cultures of the past, the idea of owning land was as strange as the idea of owning air or water. Of course, that has changed quite a bit in dominant economic logics over the past several hundred years. But how can we think property and land rights with either collective ownership, stewardship, modeling different ways of thinking about property, land as a public good? And that relates to the city level. We have to ask who owns the city, because if the response to that question should be that we all do, it means that we have to reconceive ownership. The point that the point of this slide is a piece called Microtreaties with the Earth by colleagues at Dark Matter Labs. It explores beautifully some of these questions and some different ways that we could think about ownership. The second is role of corporations. So what should be the role of corporations in today's world? Should we actually expect something different? Given where we are societally, should we expect that corporations should contribute to public good and that be a clear accountability? Should we invent institutions in parallel with tech? So tech is advancing much more quickly than institutions can to properly bound and regulate that tech for common good. How can corporations be aligned with society in creating better futures rather than continually extracting and concentrating wealth as is the dominant mode? And quickly, sovereignties. So at the city level, jurisdiction issues are so often impediments to positive change. If you work in cities, you'll know that very often national or other subnational governments make infrastructure decisions. Here where I am, billions of dollars are often invested in road infrastructure within cities that cities and the people who live here, city governments, had no capacity to decide about. It's decided at a different either national or subnational level, and that based on a certain kind of old economic logics, which actually really needs to change for future accountabilities. Okay. So onto brighter things. So bold moves. What are some of the bold moves that 7th-generation cities can make? Okay, so I'll spend the rest of the time, about 10 minutes, on some examples of each of these. So in the areas of hybrid institutional arrangements, reimagining city economies, building larger and more system demonstrators. So what I mean by that is not just pilot projects, not just small experiments. We actually need to get larger in our ambition. So what we call them system demonstrators, and ideally it's with 2 or 3 cities at a time so that they can be learning from each other, and strengthening city alliances and coalitions. So I'll give a couple of examples for each of these about how I've seen this done or possible to do. So hybrid institutional arrangements, a few examples: regulatory experimentation labs, city-nation coalition, mayors for the future. I'm not going to talk about mayors for the future now, but it's an idea I'm super excited about. So if you want to talk about it in the discussion period, or contact me afterwards, please. So regulatory experimentation labs, this is also built on work that we started several years ago with Dark Matter Labs, but working with many others from different levels of governments, from indigenous nations, and informed by also by activists and civil society. The idea is about creating regulatory experimentation labs. That's a very complex diagram, but this was the initial design for creating one in the city where I am. It has been built a little bit differently than we originally envisaged. It's less hybrid and more inside city government, and we think that it's really important that these things are hybrid so that they can be governed somewhat differently. It's also being adapted in cities in other parts of the world, including in Europe. I wanted to give this example. This is not my text that overlays. The SENAC project represents an opportunity to heal. This is language from an indigenous nation. The city you're looking at is Vancouver. And the development, which broke ground last week in the foreground, is the first of its kind in Canada, maybe in the world. So the lands that it is built on, that it will be built on, are not City of Vancouver lands. They're not even Government of Canada lands. They are actually Indigenous nation lands of the Squamish Nation. And this will be the largest net zero housing development in this country, over 7,000 housing units. And it's an example of a very different kind of economic logic. So these are the kinds of examples that we need to be building and seeing more of. Okay, second, reimagining city economies. So large-scale worker-owned collaboratives or cooperatives. One part of this, retrofits of cities, streets, neighborhoods, not only buildings, and there are many different forms of this, and open collectives. So Mondragon, it actually came up in the talk last week. Mondragon is the world's largest set of worker-owned cooperatives, and it actually grew out of the tragic situation in the Basque Country several decades ago. It had actually started before that, but it further grew and became part of the social and economic transformation of the region in the past few decades. And it's a great example to be adapted in other places according to cultural context. It's been getting a lot of attention recently, including just a few weeks ago, this article in the New Yorker. It's also the corner of the slide is a book. If you haven't read it, it's wonderful, called Ministry for the Future by the great science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson. He dedicates one chapter of the book to Mondragon and its potential for building future more social economies. Okay, another example, of course, is Batumi in Georgia. So this is an example of how we need to think differently about retrofits of our cities. So this is really about reimagining public and active transportation for that city and how that can actually transform many other kinds of behaviors and logics within the city and improve social and ecological outcomes. Another kind of what we might call proximity economy is the 15-minute city. This is it's a contested approach, but for me, what's at the core of it, which is really sound, is that it's about building our cities, rebuilding our neighborhoods and our cities so that people have access within a walk, a bike ride, other form of active or public transport within 15 minutes of where they live, to work, to services, to basic needs, to recreation, to all kinds of important things for life, to parks, to good clean air, etc. And then finally, Restart Ukraine, an excellent example of an open collective that was presented last week. If you didn't see that urban talk, I recommend having a look. It's an open collective for reimagining and rebuilding cities in Ukraine, and we all have a lot to learn from what they're doing there in Ukraine and also in other parts of the world. Okay, so system demonstrators, as I mentioned, we need to get larger than pilots, than experiments, need to get to a different scale of demonstrating what's possible. This also has to do with social infrastructure. We know that trust in most sectors is declining and in most parts of the world. Increasing trust at the local level, at neighborhood levels, at city level is so important, and we need social infrastructures that can build that kind of social cohesion. Electrifying a city is an example that's being tried in different places. Food forests and large-scale rooftop greenhouses. Two of these are written about in Sacred Civics. Those are the chapters referred to here. This is an example of social infrastructure work that I'm involved in. This is Participatory City in London, UK. And we're also building on this continent, Participatory Canada. This is an example of what it looks like for the neighborhood, the invitation to people who live in neighborhoods to take part in co-creation of the future of society, rather than being passive consumers, as we often treat people. Another great example of a system demonstrator that can be scaled. This is a blueprint for a planned roof garden in Berlin that recognizes that up to 2 million square meters of roof space just in that city could be used for plant cultivation. So we need to be thinking about where in our cities we can actually be growing food much more frequently and productively. And finally, city alliances and coalitions. So the scale and strength of cities, and particularly alliances of them, is crucial for the futures we need to build. I have a great deal of hope in things like the Global Parliament of Mayors, C40, B40, net zero cities. There are lots of great examples of these that are really having an impact. All kinds of city learning circles, including for system demonstrators, I think is something that we really need to build into our institutional frameworks for cities. One of the things that I find most interesting about the Global Parliament of Mayors is that they're one of the few groups who are actually talking about climate migration. Nation states very often are avoiding the subject. Nobody wants to deal with the fact that there are going to be tens of millions of climate refugees frequently and increasing numbers as the years go by. For an author of Sacred Civics, Kofi Boone, he sees this as an opportunity to fundamentally think differently about housing. If we actually got ahead and did that, that could be remarkable. Rebuilding housing infrastructure for the future and thinking about how we do that is so critical. The Global Parliament of Mayors is talking about this, and that's super important. Cities know that they are going to be the places where people will come. Net Zero Cities, fantastic work, mission-oriented work. More than 100 cities in Europe working towards climate neutrality by 2030. This is led by Climate Kick with many other organizations. And finally, this is a very small example that I'm involved in. Some of you in this call are involved in. We're currently, we're starting a city learning circle just with 4 cities in Eastern Europe. This one is a prototype around the topic of capability building for social listening, but also peer-to-peer learning and peer-to-peer relationality between cities. Again, I think doing this for larger scale system demonstrators is going to be really important for the future. So cities learning to adaptively respond to changing contexts, to rising uncertainty is going to be so important for the future. So I want to move to close now. So this is also the epigraph of our book. And this quote is super important to me. So it's from Toby Ord's book, The Precipice, which came out in 2020. The need to take responsibility for our future. Those of us alive right now are the only people who can fight against the present dangers, the only ones who can build the communities, norms, and institutions that will safeguard our future. Whether we are remembered as the generation who turned the corner to a bright and secure future or not remembered at all, it comes down to whether we rise to meet these challenges. I want to just add that 7 Generation Cities, it's an invitation to planetary solidarity. So let's together consider this an invitation to cultivate the strength, the wisdom, the imagination, the courage, the love that's needed to build cities that are worthy of us all, that are worthy of our ancestors and of future ancestors for 7 generations and many, many, many more. And the hopeful news is that we were all born at just the right time to help change everything. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jayne, and that was a lot to take in and also very inspiring. And before I pass it over to Darini, who will run us through the Mentimeter, I just wanted to share that I found your book very inspiring because, like this talk, it feels fresh and it feels bold. You are daring to call for paradigm shifts and naming things that we often don't name, such as the notion around private ownership, who is the city for, and somehow also that dominant narrative that the cities are disconnected and we are disconnected from nature at large. And I think in that urge to dissect or take things apart to make sense, and you're calling it for that narrative of separation, we somehow seem to be getting out of touch with a lot of things that's going on around us in the world today. And I feel like that concept around sacred civics somehow harbors that a deeper connection and a stronger sense of belonging to our surroundings. So I think, I mean, that's very inspirational. I'm very happy that you're with her today. I'm curious also to hear if so what others are thinking now after your presentation. So over to you, Darini.
Thank you, Jayne, for this very good presentation. So now, everyone, we would like to get your inputs on this. So we'll invite you to connect to Menti. If you open the chat, I'm putting the link over there. So we would invite you to share your thoughts with us. We really want to collect your insights, and alternatively, you can just go to Menti and enter the code that I've just shared in the chat. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to see the first question. We really wanted you to share with us what resonated with you. What, out of everything we just mentioned, we mentioned bold moves, we mentioned so many different ways of doing things. So we would ask you to maybe think. We gave you a huge box of letters, so feel free to be generous with your thoughts, because we really want to hear those thoughts. So the first question is about regenerative cities. We want you to think about at least three, if you can even think of one. I think we're going to be happy with that. 3 ingredients that we would need now for both present and future generations to thrive. What do you think that cities, maybe in your region, need today? And we're going to start this reflection by being very conceptual. Anything that resonated with you, take your time. So we have answers coming in. Please keep them going. We want to raise it, like we want to exchange and get your thoughts about it. Thank you for the ones who started to put. Please keep them going. And I see we have more than 1 ingredient already. Trust is a very good one. Jayne, if you would like to comment on some of those, feel free. View nature as technology is an interesting one. Love, care, hope resonates a lot with what we mentioned from Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, with the notion of connection that we have as well. Anyone else, feel free. We want to hear from you. Governance and systems, something that we mentioned as bold moves to shuffle the paradigm a little bit.
I'm not sure if we're seeing the whole screen. I think there might be a response or two we're not seeing.
Let me see.
You can just scroll.
Let me just see. Oops, sorry about that.
Maybe it's just me, I don't know, but there are just a few answers, a few responses I can't see at the bottom.
Oh, no, that's not it. Let me just stop sharing and share again. Maybe that's going to help.
Or if you can see them on your screen and we can't, maybe you could just read them.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't either. So let me just check.
Really appreciate these, each one of these responses. Thank you. Such thoughtful responses. I think someone said explorative governance. If I don't know if that person would want to say something else about that. Not to put you on the spot, but I'd be curious to hear more about that.
Sharing my screen again. This time should work. So you can see all answers. We have several over there. You can see everything. So, oops, sorry. Here's one. So that was the first batch of answers, and we have a second batch right here. Anyone would like to unmute and expand and share a bit more about their insights? Don't be shy. We're all friends here. It's all about hearing more about what you had to say. You've been very generous in your and your thoughts. We would love to hear from you.
Yes, please raise your hand.
Daniela has raised her hand.
Yeah, hi, Daniela Bovic, I'm economic development specialist from Belgrade. Yeah, just to refer to the explorative governance thing, we've been in Belgrade, we've been doing on researching how we can actually expand development across the country. We've been doing a lot on the depopulation problem and the problem that our cities are actually shrinking. And everything that you showed here, we have additional dimension that actually people are leaving cities. And now you have even less resources that are, cumulative to the economic problems, to the problems of nature and all that stuff. So, but the things that we were, as a consequence of everything of that is that we do not have capacity within our local administration. So in terms of when we want to try to expand ecosystems and capacities within cities, we cannot rely only on city administration. And that's a huge problem because oftentimes donor communities in our country actually try to put entire effort in the own development on cities. So we have, for example, local economic development offices that end up doing other administrative stuff. They actually don't have capacity, but more importantly, they don't even have a mandate to do so because they don't have integrity within economic community that actually they're the ones who actually have to push that. So now we are thinking to explore more. I think that I saw on your slide something like systems within the governments that is like more alternative ones. So we're trying to find new actors within the ecosystem that are actually that have mandate, that have interest to be included in economic development in cities and collaborate with cities. It is hard because we have this usual thing how we think should operate, but now we, for example, have in some bigger cities science technology parks that are really good connection point for economic system at one side, but they're also financed by the government. So we are trying to put them into the center of the ecosystem to try to connect entire, the small and medium companies and to connect them to the city administration as well. I mean, this is just, we are just thinking now about that. We will see if we are going to be successful in applying that. But this is our initial thoughts on that, because we have to find more alternative ways how we govern, for example, development on a local level. Because otherwise, if we rely only on the local authorities, I'm not sure that we will have the result that we actually want to have.
I'd love to respond to that. Thank you so much for sharing that, Daniela, and super insightful and important, everything that you say, and I see similar things. So lots in what you said. There's a matter of shrinking cities. There's a matter of how cities are financed. So how do they have revenue, where it comes from, what the basis, is, whether it's, property taxes, whether it's from national governments, whether it's based on population, because sometimes declining populations means that actually social services are more expensive, but you actually have less revenue. So all kinds of things that you raise are super important and of course shared by cities in many places. So how cities are financed, how they're governed, and I love these notions of different kinds of governance at city level. So it means different kinds of governance and different kinds of power. I don't know if you heard the talk by Istanbul a couple of weeks ago that was really good, where he talked about the vision for planning Istanbul in 2050. And how everything that they're planning for the future of the city, it actually will require that the city has more and different powers. So it will require that some jurisdictions and sovereignties that national government currently holds over the city will have to be decentralized. So that's also important. So much of the futures we have, and it does require different kinds of governance. And I think we need to get so much more imaginative about this, as it sounds like you're starting starting to do. So I had mentioned some forms like hybrid. We have worked on building hybrid experimentation labs so that there could be 1 foot inside city government to have the legitimacy and access to regulatory change, but 1 foot outside to develop stronger private sector partnerships and also better civil society relationships, even, things that could be governed by civic assemblies for the future, for example, but also have private investment in experiments or system demonstrators. So I think there are all kinds of things that we need to open up in terms of our imagination at governance locally. And it also relates to not only national, because in some cases, national and other subnational governments are going to be very resistant, of course, to change the situation. So it's also going to require, I think, stronger alliances of cities across national boundaries in order to push for that kind of change. So I'll stop there, but thanks very much.
Anyone else wanted to expand on their thoughts? I would be, for one, very curious to hear about the person who shared view nature as technology to expand on this. It's a very interesting one. So whoever wrote that, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand so we can see who you are. If there's anyone else who would like to expand more on your thoughts, we welcome the conversation to get you involved in what mattered to you, what resonated with you. Any one of those. Don't be shy.
We have Megan, I believe, have raised her hand. Maybe we can give the floor to her.
Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Megan Tenoff. I'm zooming in from Somerville, Mass, which is the Thank you so much, Jayne and UNDP, for this really inspiring talk this morning. I would like to talk a little bit more about polarization.
Again, if you can talk closer to your mic, I think we have difficulty hearing you. So if you could just be closer to your microphone, it would be helpful.
Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit more about polarization, and if we could have some suggestions or ideas about how to move past that and get, I work with small cities now in the, mid-Atlantic and South. I'm just trying to think about brainstorming how to move from this extreme polarization and these, just thinking about, can't even say climate change. So you have to even completely reorient your thoughts and your delivery. And that's one of the things that's really great. And I'm gonna have to stew about this a little bit more to think about how to deliver these messages. But if I could just have a little bit more about trying to get people to see the sacred and find commonality in the things that we love.
Yeah, it's a big question. And hello, Megan. It's good to see you again. Yeah, polarization. We know that it's growing, and it's showing up in many ways. It's showing up in breakdowns of trust and social unrest and so on. And it has to do with many things. One thing certainly we know that it has something to do with our technologies, including social media, and really a breakdown in many ways of how we all get information and the incentives for how we get information. And the example I gave in the assumptions on my screen was a place called the Center for Humane Technologies, which was actually started by some brilliant people who used to be in tech, Tristan Harris, Asa Raskin, among others. And some of the things that they're calling for, they have a great podcast and putting out lots of papers and so on. But some of the things that they're calling for is for tech companies to have a different kind of accountability, self-accountability in some cases, because governments in most cases aren't regulating or bounding well. And also naming the power that they have to make change, and at the same time, while recognizing that the realities are that some companies, of course, will say, well, if we don't do it, this other company will, and so on. So we're really trapped in logics of these broken information ecologies, which are exacerbating polarization. Because my feeds are completely different than the feeds of people who have different views than I do, and we continually get information that is reinforcing what we believe and appealing to the darker sides of ourselves when possible, because it sells more. These are advertising companies, right? These are not these companies are not acting in public good. So it's also one of the reasons why the role of corporations has to be challenged. So if we currently have governance institutions which cannot keep up with technologies, and almost by definition, the kinds of institutions that we have cannot keep up with how technology is evolving to properly bound and regulate, then it's incumbent upon the technologies to have more accountability themselves in societal interests. That's not necessarily what can each of us do about that? Well, that's hard. I mean, collectively we can as society. Individually, it's hard to do a lot about. I think naming it is really important. And then for me, I'll just share on a personal level. So for me, I find it super important, and it's actually highly motivating to think in these very large planetary, structural, institutional ways, and also to act very much in a granular and local way. So the kinds of polarization you're talking about, we are addressing at the neighborhood level by being radically inclusive in building social infrastructures of the participatory city approach. And that is about providing spaces where all people can feel welcome, can feel included, and also even in those spaces, designing them in ways to raise people's imaginations and expectations about what the future can be, while also being very much in the here and now of people's everyday lived experience of challenge, of hardship, of cost of living crisis, and so on. So I think the social infrastructure, and a last word, this is a long response, but a last word on that I'd like to say is, when I think about social infrastructure, I think what is the library system that we need for our times, right? Library systems were transformational. Many years ago, 100 or so years ago, library systems in many countries of the world changed societies, gave opportunities to people, access to knowledge who didn't have it. They created all kinds of things, not perfectly everywhere, of course, but I think that's a great kind of example of the kind of social infrastructure we need to think about for the future. We're holding that kind of aspiration when we think about participatory city. We're not the only approach. There are many other social infrastructure approaches, but that's how we think about it. What is a social infrastructure for our times that is systemic, that is participatory, that is radically inclusive, that invites the creativity of everyone in building and imagining different futures together? And how can that start at the neighborhood level? And that certainly for me is one great way to address polarization at the local level, and the extent to which those can be more globally connected, all the better. And I'll stop there, but if other people have responses about this, I would welcome hearing from others too.
Does anyone else have something to add to the topic and wanted to contribute to this part of the conversation? Same thing, raise your hand. You know the drill by now. If not, is there anyone else who wants to expand on what they wrote before we move on to the next question? We talked about governance, we talked about polarization. Anything else anyone wanted to expand on? We'd be happy to discuss. All right, I'll give it another 10 seconds for someone to raise their hand. And if not, we'll move on to the next question. All right, I think I'm going to move on to the next question. So now that we talked about concepts, we wanted to anchor it into the real. And the next question is about thinking about examples. So can you think of any examples that are in your region? So we mentioned in the talk, like Jayne mentioned, the example of Seoul, like a highway became a river. Can you think of examples that are happening in your region? And if you cannot think of anything in the past, maybe you could think about something that could happen in the future. What does your city, your region have that could actually be a testimonial of applying those concepts? Take your time, think about what you know. It's all about anchoring those concepts into reality. So tell us more about your city. Tell us more about your region. Don't be shy. Come on, we have about 20 people and I know you all come from all over the world, so we want to hear from you. Oh yeah, sure, I'll drop the Menti chat again, just in case people dropped out of it. So the direct link is here. If you logged out by mistake, so there it is. Or alternatively, you can go to Menti and enter the code. Hope everyone got that. So you go to the chat, you have the link. Oh, there we go. Champ des possibles, early parties, OCPM. If you're going to starting with acronyms, we're going to have to ask you to mute and talk about it a bit more. Come on, we have 3 answers. You can do up to 3 answers each. So we could definitely get more than this. There are 20 people in the chat right now, so I'm pretty sure you can all come up with something about your cities. Your cities, your regions. We want to hear from more. So it could be anything from the past or something that could happen in the future. San Francisco. Keep those answers going and flowing. How can we do this? How can we make sure that we can take action for those cities to be 7th generation cities? Sarajevo Act. So there are things happening here and there. Keep getting those answers, and maybe someone who wanted to share something else share something else. I mean, expand on what. So we have more coming. Thank you so much. Transforming city rivers. So same thing as before, we want to hear from you. So if anyone wants to expand on the example and tell us about that story and that example, please raise your hand and share about what's happening in your region. We want to hear from you. And it's interesting because we have people from all over the place, so we can know what's happening in different things. Eskişehir in Turkey, we have San Francisco, we have Sarajevo, so different regions here. Plant house walls, urban farming. Anybody wants to unmute and talk about their examples and tell us about those stories? We want to hear more.
I will kick us off if that's okay.
Go for it. Go for it.
All right. So I put in the Embarcadero in San Francisco, and a reason I put this in is It's an example of a major power shift that happened at a city government level. And I'm sure there's a study about this, but I would love more research into this kind of thing. So what happened was there was something called the Embarcadero Expressway. It was a highway in San Francisco that was majorly damaged in a San Francisco earthquake many years ago. And after the earthquake, as is typical, the state government wanted to move immediately to rebuilding the highway as it was this highway on, that really dominated the river. It separated the city from the water. So state government moved to, say, okay, we're going to invest in rebuilding it as it was. People in the city didn't want that. The mayor didn't want that, but they actually didn't have jurisdiction. And they fought it. And the mayor managed to take power and not have that highway rebuilt. And it was actually torn down and transformational for the city, of course. And so the Embarcadero was not rebuilt as a highway. And now it's transformational for San Francisco, but the mayor somehow took power. And there are all, I'm sure there are like very well documented case studies on how that happened. But, to me, that's the kind of thing. There has to be more of that kind of power, because very often mayors and city governments are the most visionary long-term leaders, and yet they have a dissonance of lack of power and also service delivery. So it's in their rational interest to just focus on trash pickup today and meeting social needs today for the people who are suffering in their cities. And yet, so very often they don't have the kind of power that would actually benefit local people and the environment so much. So I think it's so important that we think about governance for the future holistically, and again, how mayors can have more powers in cases like this.
Thank you for sharing. That's a very interesting one, especially in a city like San Francisco. Don't make me cold call people, but I really want to hear about the Sarajevo Act, because I feel like people are engaging about it in the chat as well. So whoever wants to talk about that. So people are curious in the chat. So whoever wrote about that, please tell us more about this. We want to hear from you.
I need to comment something. And just being a little bit mindful of time, I think the floor can also just be open for anyone. If there are any other reflections, any questions, I have a few questions myself, but I'll hold them for now in case there's anybody else who raises their hand.
Anyone else want to tell us the examples you wrote? We have a couple of good examples in there.
And the person who wrote about Sarajevo Act is sitting in this room, so I think she should come to the microphone and she can talk to us about it.
Hi.
Hello, Leila.
Yes, I've just been listening silently and secretly, but since I got called out. So Sarajevo Act is really community-based. I'm not even sure that they're a registered organization, and they started as like purely activist type of thing from a need that young artists in general in Sarajevo actually didn't have a place in which they could show their art. So as a way for them to show their art, a lot of buildings that were built during socialist period, they have these common spaces, which were also falling apart because this idea of common space and public space was changing as the system was changing towards more, I'd say, a capitalist one. So then this group of young people got together and started restoring spaces in common spaces in neighborhoods as a way that artists for young artists to display their work. And this led to small, but I'd say very meaningful initiatives around taking back public space, reorganizing public space, and actually communities getting together, whereas they've been continually, I would say, driving towards more individualization and less care social space and just public space actually in general. So that's, I think, a part of their story.
Thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Leila.
Unless there's anyone else who wants to share, we can move on to question. Is there anyone who would like to share the stories?
So as we wait, maybe one question to Jayne from my side. Jayne, you talk a lot about, on one hand, to recognize the cities and the local governments, and even down at the neighborhood level, and the need to kind of be radically inclusive and do actions at that level. But then also you talk about the idea, of course, on planetary level, solidarity institutions. So it's seeing that we're at UNDP, and this is a UNDP talk, I want to ask a bold question around also rethinking purpose and role of organizations. As we know, we need quite a few of these paradigm shifts to make 7th generation cities. And the UN, of course, is anything as anything else is a product of its time, and a cornerstone of course of our work and our identity and the entire public international legal structure. Of course, it's the idea of member states and state sovereignty. Now, of course, we see that mayors are at the forefront and local governments are at the forefront of the most pressing issues today. And many of the issues that we're facing, including the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and these things, what is needed is, of course, beyond the idea of sovereignty. Actually, sovereignty at times could be counterproductive to that international solidarity. We saw that, I think, quite strongly during COVID times. So what do you have any advice for us, or what do you see that we need as an organization or as professionals to support these needed changes, while then being mindful, of course, and maybe admitting at times and naming that our organization, of course, also by our existence, we also uphold certain power dynamics and asymmetries. So are we more part of the problem than we like to admit? Over to you.
Oh my, that's a big question. I think we need another hour and a half or so just for that one. Okay, so a couple of thoughts. I mean, thank you for the question. I mean, the fact that you even asked that question is a very good sign. And, as you know, I've had a chance to work a little bit with UNDP over the past few months and see inside a little bit. And even though on the one hand, you do have all of the logics and opportunities and constraints that go with being the kind of organization that you are, that you mentioned, I also find it remarkable and really commendable some of the things that you are able to drive forward. I mean, not least things like this talk, things like the reports that I mentioned, which are really important. They're really good contributions. They're not the language of wood, la langue du bois, as we say in French. They are really meaningful and they meet the moment, which very often institutional documents do not. So it feels like within the constraints that you have, you're doing a lot of what you can. Now, the constraints that you have are a challenge, as you mentioned, right? So because we have a situation where nation states, of course, there are 190 some, I guess, who are members. How many of those have real power? How many of those have real sovereignty? Some argue that 10 or less, depending on how you look at it on a planetary stage. And of course, many small nations are far smaller in terms of population than many cities, right? So that's one thing to consider. Another thing is that for the good of all of us, I talk a lot about planetary solidarity because I really think that has to be the goal. And I want for all of us, for us collectively as a species. And there's so much even about nation state logics where nation states don't even have certain powers, right? Because of course, nation states, like we are trapped into dynamics of game theoretic logics where, we can't stop artificial intelligence, including for military. It can't be stopped because if one country does it, another country has to do it, or else that one country will dominate. So I'm not blind, I'm not idealistic. Like I recognize these, call them game theoretic logics, multipolar traps. Somebody who talks, there are lots of people who talk far more eloquently than I could about these problems, but I really like the work of Daniel Schmachtenberger. If people don't know him, he's talked a lot about geopolitics and sort of the challenges that we're in. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not idealistic about those. At the same time, I think that they're not going to get us to the futures that we need. So we need to think about changing accountabilities. We need to think about, and I wouldn't even say international, but more planetary institutions, because they shouldn't only be bound by nation states. So we have some examples on a small scale that exist. So if we think about something like global commons law, so global commons law applies to certain parts of the earth, the high seas, parts of the Arctic. I think adapting things like global commons law, which has actors who are nation states, also has indigenous nations who are actors, sometimes even individuals. I think these kinds of hybrid forms we have to think about also in other parts of the globe. So not just where they're applied now in certain jurisdictions. I also think things like another thing that gives me a lot of hope is it's small and experimental till now, but something called the Global Citizens Assembly. So if people know about the Global Citizens Assembly, it was created in the lead up to COP26, where 100 randomly selected people from around the world were chosen to be part of a civic assembly, and it was based on population, so not based on power of existing nations, simply based on population. So obviously the majority of people from the global south and so on. And it doesn't have teeth and it doesn't have power, but to me that actually is a window. It's an experiment that a lot can be learned from, and it could be scaled and adapted to different contexts. And I think that the UNDP creating some hybrid forms that again, to me, hybrid institutions are so important for what Daniela called explorative governance, so that we can actually try different things, but they have to have some connection to the existing institutions for both legitimacy and access. And they have to have a foot outside so that they have the freedom to do some things differently. So, if the UN or UNDP could create that kind of thing, I think it could go a long way. So hybrid forms to develop new capabilities, and also to think in terms of, I often think about the major the superpowers of the world. Think US, China. Then we have hyper agents. We call what Daniel Schmachtenberger calls hyper agents and egregores. Which I won't go into right now, but those are super important ways to understand where the world is. I also see a countervailing powers which are necessary. And in that sense, I think about coalitions, not only of cities, but cities with small nations and social movements. So social movements are rising, and social movements around the world are extraordinary, and yet they have not had the agency for the radical change that they have demanded. They've made some change, of course, but there's so much more that social movements can contribute, and they just haven't had the kind of agency that they ought to. And small nations, incredibly progressive around the world. I mean, think about, not only the obvious ones, New Zealand, Finland, Iceland, Wales, Scotland, Costa Rica, think about Barbados, the moves that the brilliant prime minister there has made recently. So I imagine coalitions of smaller nations with large cities, with social movements. So, you know, how could the UN also be engaged in those kinds of coalitions? I recognize that small nations have very little power, probably within the UN because of their size, because of their positionality. What if they had different kinds of coalitions? So those are just some initial thoughts.
Thank you, Jayne. That's a lot. That's a lot of food for thought and also inspiration. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. We have a few more minutes. Are there any other comments or any other questions to Jayne before we wrap it up? I see Colleen is writing in the chat about the need for more participatory approaches. Anybody else who would like to raise their hand, share an example or any questions or reflections to Jayne? All right, Jayne, is there any final words or any final remarks from your side in terms of where are you heading with this work now, Sacred Civics?
Thank you for asking. That's a really good question. I am figuring that out right now because a remarkable thing about it is we have been pleasantly surprised at the incredible resonance of Sacred Civics, of the book and of the thought, to the extent that university courses are using it as a foundational text, not just for decolonizing planning, but literally at Tufts University for their foundational course in urban policy and planning. That's one of 3 foundational texts. So they're seeing it as, you know, this is thinking that we need for the future. So that is, you know, that makes me super hopeful. I've also had cities come to me individually and say, we love this. This is great. And why don't you create a 7-generation cities network? Say what it should be and we'll join, but we need to be in it with others. So lots of that kind of feedback is coming in. So we're figuring out how best to respond, because it's wonderful. I guess I'll say one more thing that actually didn't come up because nobody asked about mayors for the future. So if I can plug this last idea, and if anybody wants to talk about it more afterwards, I'd be happy to. So it comes from an observation that I mentioned briefly in another response, is that cities have this tremendous dissonance where they are, in many ways, they're primarily service delivery agents. So given that it is in their rational expectation and rational interest to keep expectations of people in the city low, so that people are happy, so that they're content, so that they're okay with the service delivery, so that they're, you know, healthy enough so that they vote for them and so on. At the same time, I also find that mayors and city governments are often the most visionary, including about long-term futures. And yet they have this dissonance because sort of working towards that long-term future with this main need for service delivery, those are often at odds. And so an idea that I've discussed, including with the chiefs of staff of a couple of city governments, is why don't you create a mayor for the future, which again would be a hybrid institution so that it could be close to city government and with the logics of, and governed by a civic assembly for the future, and maybe even elected by people as young as 15 or 16, but especially for the long-term part, and to be connected with the legitimacy of existing government. And the people in city governments who I've discussed this with have said, we love the idea. And then the first question is, who else is doing it? Right? Cities can't do this alone. These are bold, these are difficult moves that they would need to do together with others. Could be a system demonstrator. Think of it like that. So maybe that's the thing that I'll close on. Mayors for the future.
Mayors for the future. Thank you so much, Jayne. I think it's exciting to see what comes out of that, and we'll be paying attention, and we would love to be part of that journey as well. So thank you again, for such a pleasure to have you with us, and thanks for the inspiring talk. And next week we have another urban talk, which we will introduce the concept of urban makeover, and we'll be talking to the municipality in Batumi in Georgia, and they will share a bit about how they're exploring new trajectories of growth and making the city more vibrant and attractive, also for youth. So that's coming up next week, and a registration link will soon be going out. So thank you all for joining the call today. Stay in touch, and good day to everyone from Istanbul. Thank you, Jayne.
And thank you so much, Tina, Leila, Darini, everyone at UNDP, and thank you everyone who participated and was here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all.